Hello and welcome to Religion Anatomy. Aura perception is the science behind seeing what shouldn't be there. Imagine sitting in a meditation hall. The room is quiet. The light is low. Around you, 20 other people are seated in stillness, eyes closed, breathing slowly. You have been meditating for 3 hours, maybe 4. Your ordinary thinking mind has gone somewhere else. The planning, the narrating, the constant low-level noise of modern consciousness has, for once, fallen silent. And then you open your eyes, and the person sitting across from you is on fire. Not literally, not dangerously, but radiating visibly, unmistakably, in colors you do not have adequate language for, a field of light that extends several inches beyond the edges of their skin. It pulses slowly, it shifts. It is different around their head than around their hands. It is different from the field radiating off the meditator to their left. And the plant in the corner of the room, the ordinary potted plant that has been there the entire time, is doing it too. You blink. You look away. You look back. It is still there. You are not on any substance. You have no history of psychosis. You have no diagnosed neurological condition. You are a person who sat very still for a long time and opened their eyes, and the world now has edges it did not have before. Glowing, colored, unmistakably present edges. What just happened to you? Is this hallucination? Is it neurological? Is it a genuine perceptual capacity that deep contemplative states unlock? A sensitivity to something that is actually there, radiating from living bodies, that normal waking consciousness is too. Busy and too loud to register? Or is the human brain, under specific conditions, simply generating images that feel more real than reality, and calling them truth? This question sits at the intersection of neuroscience, physics, contemplative tradition, and the oldest, most persistent category of human perceptual experience. Seeing something that ordinary people do not see. And the answers, all of them, are stranger than you expect. The history of the aura is older than any religion. Before engaging the science, it is essential to understand how ancient, how widespread, and how structurally consistent the aura tradition is across human cultures, because what is most striking about aura perception is not that it occurs. It is that it has always occurred in every era, on every continent, documented by traditions with no possible contact with one another, and that the descriptions are remarkably, uncomfortably similar. The concept of a luminous field surrounding the human body appears in ancient Egyptian iconography, the golden nimbus surrounding divine figures in temple paintings and papyrus texts. It appears in Hindu tradition as the prana field, the subtle energetic envelope of the living body described in Vedic texts dating to at least 1500 BCE and mapped in extraordinary detail by the yogic tradition into a system of colored layers, each associated with different aspects of physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual functioning. In ancient Greece, the Pythagoreans, the philosophical school founded by Pythagoras in the 6th century BCE, held that the human body emanates a luminous field perceptible to sensitive individuals, and that disruptions to this field precede physical illness. This is documented in accounts preserved by later historians and in the Neoplatonic tradition that drew heavily on Pythagorean thought. Chinese traditional medicine describes the concept of qi, the vital energy that flows through the body along pathways called meridians, as something that under certain conditions becomes visible, as a luminous emanation from the body's surface. The Japanese concept of qi is functionally identical. Korean medicine describes it as gi. The common thread across East Asian healing traditions is the same. Living bodies emit something. Trained perception can detect it. The something, whatever it is, has structure, color, and diagnostic significance. In Christian iconography, the luminous field surrounding holy figures, the halo, the mandorla, the nimbus, has been part of the visual vocabulary of sacred art since at least the 4th century CE. In Eastern Orthodox Christian theology, the divine light perceived surrounding holy persons. The uncreated light described in Hesychast mystical tradition and associated with the transfiguration of Christ is not regarded as metaphor. It is understood as a genuine perceptual phenomenon available to those who have achieved a sufficient degree of contemplative purification. The 19th century brought the aura into systematic Western investigation through the theosophical tradition, particularly through the work of Charles Leadbeater, whose 1903 work The Chakras and his collaborations with Annie Besant attempted to map the subtle body and its emanations with the systematic precision of a natural scientist. Their descriptions, detailed, consistent, and remarkably convergent with much older traditions, generated enormous controversy and remain disputed, but they established the aura as a subject of formal investigative interest in Western esoteric thought. The persistent cross-cultural consistency of aura descriptions across traditions with no documented contact raises a question that deserves to be taken seriously before any explanation is offered. What are all these people actually seeing? What the brain does under contemplative conditions, modern neuroscience, offers a set of explanations for aura perception that are genuine, well-evidenced, and deeply interesting, while also being, if followed to their logical conclusions, more philosophically strange than most neuroscientists are comfortable acknowledging. The most thoroughly studied neurological basis for aura perception is a phenomenon called synesthesia, a neurological condition in which stimulation of one sensory pathway produces automatic, involuntary, and consistent experiences in a second sensory pathway. The most common form is chromesthesia, sound-to-color synesthesia, in which musical notes or other sounds produce distinct, stable color perceptions. But a related and less commonly discussed form, called emotional color synesthesia or person color synesthesia, produces color perceptions specifically associated with other people. Individuals with person color synesthesia report seeing consistent, stable color fields surrounding or associated with specific people, fields that change with the person's emotional state, that differ between individuals and that are experienced as genuinely external perceptions rather than imagined overlays. Critically, neuroimaging studies of synesthetes, conducted by researchers including Dr. Jamie Ward at the University of Sussex and Dr. Villayanur Ramachandran at the University of California, San Diego, have confirmed that these color perceptions activate the same regions of the visual cortex, specifically the V4 color processing area, as genuine visual stimuli. Synesthetes are not imagining the colors in any ordinary sense. Their visual cortex is generating them in response to non-visual triggers. Ramachandran, one of the most respected neuroscientists working in this area, has proposed that synesthesia results from cross-activation between adjacent cortical regions, areas of the brain that process different sensory modalities firing together due to what he describes as excess neural connectivity or reduced inhibitory separation between adjacent processing areas. His research has suggested that synesthesia is far more common in artistic and creative individuals, and most relevantly for our purposes in meditators. A 2019 study published in the journal Mindfulness, conducted by researchers at the universities of Padova and Torino in Italy, examined synesthetic experiences in long-term meditators and found a striking pattern. Meditation practice was significantly associated with synesthetic-type perceptual experiences, particularly the perception of colors associated with other people and living organisms. Long-term meditators reported aura-type perceptions at substantially higher rates than non-meditating controls. The mechanism proposed by the researchers connects directly to what is known about the neurological effects of deep meditation on sensory processing. Extended contemplative practice, particularly practices that emphasize sustained, non-reactive, highly refined attention, consistently produces changes in the activity of the thalamus, the brain's primary sensory relay. Ordinarily, the thalamus acts as a gating mechanism, filtering the vast majority of sensory input before it reaches conscious awareness. During deep meditation, this filtering activity changes significantly, allowing sensory signals that would normally be suppressed to reach cortical awareness. In plain terms, deep meditation opens gates in the brain's sensory processing that are ordinarily kept closed. What comes through those gates? What was always arriving at the thalamus but never reaching consciousness may include subtler, lower amplitude signals from the visual system. Signals that, under normal conditions of ordinary waking consciousness, are drowned out by higher amplitude inputs, including potentially signals associated with actual light emission from biological organisms. Do bodies actually radiate something visible? This is the section that changes the entire nature of the conversation, because the answer is yes. Living biological organisms, humans, animals, plants, emit light, not metaphorically, not spiritually, physically, measurably, using instruments. The phenomenon is called Biophoton Emission, also referred to as ultrawave photon emission, and it has been a legitimate subject of biophysical research since the pioneering work of German biophysicist Fritz Albert Popp, beginning in the 1970s. Popp, working at the University of Kaiserslautern and later at the International Institute of Biophysics, developed instruments sensitive enough to detect and measure the extremely low-intensity light emitted by living cells and demonstrated that this emission is not thermal radiation, not simply heat, but coherent, structured light arising from biological processes within living cells. The photons are emitted primarily from metabolic processes, particularly the oxidative reactions of cellular respiration and the excited states of molecules involved in DNA replication and repair. They are real. They are measurable. They have been independently confirmed by laboratories worldwide. A 2009 study published in PLOS One by Japanese researchers Masaki Kobayashi, Daisuke Kikuchi, and Hitoshi Okamura used a specialized high-sensitivity CCD camera system to capture actual images of the biophoton field surrounding the human body, demonstrating that this emission is not uniform but follows specific patterns, is most intense around the face and hands, and fluctuates across the day. In rhythmic cycles, the human biophoton field is real. It has been photographed. But here is the critical caveat that intellectual honesty requires. The intensity of biophoton emission is approximately 1,000 times weaker than the threshold of normal human visual perception. Under ordinary conditions, with an ordinary visual system operating in ordinary waking consciousness, you cannot see biophotons. The signal is real. The eye, under standard conditions, cannot detect it. But the standard conditions are precisely what deep meditation disrupts. When extended contemplative practice alters thalamic filtering, when the gates ordinarily keeping low-amplitude signals from reaching consciousness are opened, is it possible that signals at or near the threshold of visual detection become perceptible? Is it possible that what meditators are seeing when they report aura perception is, at least partially, a real photonic signal that their altered neurological state has amplified past the threshold of detection? This is not established scientific fact. It is a hypothesis, a serious, evidence-informed hypothesis generated by the convergence of biophoton research and contemplative neuroscience that has not yet been tested under controlled conditions. Fritz Albert Popp himself, in his later work, drew explicit connections between biophoton emission and the traditional concept of the aura, suggesting that the structured, coherent light field surrounding living organisms might constitute the physical substrate of what contemplative traditions have described for millennia. He was not a mystic making this claim. He was a biophysicist with a career of peer-reviewed research behind him. No discussion of aura perception is complete without engaging seriously with Kirlian photography, the most extensively publicized and most extensively disputed attempt to visually capture what auric perception claims to perceive. Kirlian photography, developed by Soviet electrician Semyon Kirlian and his wife Valentina in 1939, is a technique for capturing on photographic film or digital sensor the corona discharge produced when a biological object is placed on a photographic plate connected to a high-voltage, high-frequency power source. The resulting images, which show luminous, colored halos and emanations surrounding the subject, became, in the 1970s, a subject of enormous scientific and popular interest, particularly when it was claimed that the technique could capture the so-called phantom leaf effect, an apparent corona discharge corresponding to the shape of a leaf even after a portion of the leaf had been physically removed. The scientific investigation of Kirlian photography was thorough, serious, and ultimately produced mixed conclusions. On the one hand, researchers including Dr. Thelma Moss at UCLA's Neuropsychiatric Institute conducted extensive studies of Kirlian imagery in the 1970s, reporting that the corona discharge patterns showed consistent differences between healthy and diseased plant tissue, between emotionally different states in human subjects, and between living and recently dead organisms. These findings, if replicable, would suggest that Kirlian photography is capturing something biologically meaningful. On the other hand, rigorous independent investigation demonstrated that many of the most dramatic Kirlian effects, including the phantom leaf effect, were attributable to moisture content in subject material, pressure variation during image capture, and artifacts of the photographic process itself. The scientific consensus that emerged was that Kirlian photography captures primarily electrostatic corona discharge influenced by the moisture content and conductivity of the biological surface, not a luminous energy field in any more exotic sense. This conclusion, however, does not settle the question as cleanly as it is sometimes presented. The fact that a specific photographic technique captures moisture-mediated corona discharge does not rule out the existence of a genuine biophoton field. These are different phenomena, and the debunking of one does not entail the debunking of the other. The lesson of the Kirlian case is not that the aura doesn't exist. It is that the history of aura research has been plagued by premature claims, inadequate controls, and the persistent conflation of distinct physical phenomena. A more rigorous approach, one that distinguishes between biophoton emission, electrostatic effects, synesthetic perception, and altered sensory processing, is needed before any confident conclusions can be reached in either direction. What traditions say about color and meaning setting the science aside momentarily. Because the science, while real and important, does not fully contain what the contemplative traditions are. Describing it is worth engaging seriously with what those traditions actually say about aura perception and what they claim it reveals. The yogic tradition of India, articulated most systematically in the theosophical synthesis of the 19th and 20th centuries, describes the human aura as composed of multiple distinct layers, each associated with a different dimension of the human person, each visible in a different color or quality of light, and each diagnostically significant in specific ways. The etheric body, the innermost layer described as a pale bluish or grayish emanation closely following the contours of the physical body, is said to reflect the state of the physical organism. Disturbances in this layer are claimed to precede physical illness. The astral or emotional body, extending further, described in colors ranging across the entire spectrum depending on emotional state, is said to reflect the moment-to-moment emotional and desire life of the person, red in anger, green in envy or in healing intention, gold in states of spiritual aspiration, gray in depression, pink in affection. The mental body, yet further extended, described as bright yellows and blues, is said to reflect the quality and activity of thought. Higher bodies, described as increasingly luminous, increasingly subtle, increasingly difficult to distinguish individually, are associated with dimensions of the person that the tradition regards as closest to pure consciousness. Whatever one makes of these claims ontologically, two things deserve acknowledgement. First, the internal consistency of these descriptions across independently developed traditions, Vedic, Tibetan Buddhist, Chinese Taoist, and Western esoteric, is genuine and difficult to account for purely as cultural transmission. Second, the clinical application of aura perception, the use of perceived auric color changes to diagnose and monitor health conditions, has been practiced within traditional medical systems for millennia, and some of its specific claims have proved consistent enough to generate research interest in integrative medicine settings. The work of Dr. Valerie Hunt at UCLA, conducted in the 1970s and 1980s, represents the most rigorous attempt to correlate trained aura perceivers' reports with independent physiological measurements. Hunt used EMG electrodes to measure the electromagnetic field at the skin surface, while trained aura readers described what they were perceiving. The frequency analyses of the electromagnetic field data showed correlations, imperfect, contested, but present with the colors simultaneously reported by the perceivers. Hunt's methodology has been criticized and her conclusions remain controversial, but they have not been definitively refuted. We have now arrived at the place where honest inquiry has to stop choosing sides. The aura perception experience, seeing colored fields of light surrounding living bodies, occurs. It has been reported by meditators, by synesthetes, by individuals under contemplative conditions, by healers in traditional medical systems, and by ordinary people in the immediate aftermath of extraordinary emotional or perceptual experiences across every culture and every century of documented human history. The neurological explanations, synesthetic cross-activation, thalamic gate opening through meditation, altered sensory filtering in contemplative states are real, well-evidenced, and account for a significant portion of the phenomenon. The physical substrate, biophoton emission, the measurable, coherent light field surrounding living organisms, is real, independently confirmed, and suggestive without being conclusive. The philosophical question, whether a perception generated by unusual neurological conditions is therefore merely hallucinatory, or whether it might constitute access to a real signal that ordinary consciousness is too noisy to receive, remains genuinely open. Thomas Nagel, one of the most important philosophers of mind of the 20th century, famously argued in his 1974 paper, "What is it like to be a bat?" that consciousness and subjective experience are not reducible to third-person physical descriptions. The full reality of a perceptual experience cannot be captured by a description of the neural events that produce it. What it is like to see an aura, the quality of the experience, its immediacy, its emotional weight, its apparent external reality, is not explained by saying synesthetic cross-activation in V4. That description identifies a mechanism. It does not explain the experience. The meditator who opens her eyes after 4 hours of deep practice and sees the person across from her surrounded by golden light is having an experience. The neuroscientist can identify several of the mechanisms involved. The physicist can confirm that real photons are leaving the other person's body. The philosopher can note that the relationship between mechanism and experience remains poorly understood. What none of them can do with honesty is say with certainty what the meditator is seeing. Whether it is the brain's artwork, whether it is a real signal amplified past the usual threshold, whether it is both simultaneously, whether the distinction between those possibilities is as clean as it seems, the aura remains, after all the science and all the philosophy and all the ancient testimony, genuinely unresolved. And that unresolved quality, the fact that something so persistently, universally and specifically reported remains beyond definitive explanation, is itself one of the most interesting facts about human perception. The questions glowing at the edge of this. Don't move past these quickly. They deserve more than a scroll. If trained meditators worldwide, across cultures with no contact with each other, across centuries with no shared tradition, report seeing the same colored fields around living bodies with the same structural consistency. And if living bodies genuinely emit measurable coherent light, and if deep meditation genuinely opens sensory gates ordinarily kept closed, at what point does the burden of proof shift? At what point does "I can't explain why they all see the same thing" become more interesting than "it must be hallucination"? Synesthetes who see colors around people are not considered delusional. Their visual cortex generates real, consistent, stable color perceptions in response to real stimuli. Meditators who see auras after hours of practice are generating perceptions through an altered but documented neurological state. What is the principal distinction between a synesthetic color perception and an aura perception? Is the difference the social context in which it occurs, the tradition it is embedded in, the degree to which it makes people uncomfortable? If the biophoton field surrounding your body is real, if you are genuinely, physically, at this moment, radiating structured, coherent light from every cell of your body, and if that field changes with your emotional state, your health, your level of vitality, as the research suggests it does, then what are the implications for how we think about the body's relationship to consciousness? Is the light an effect of what happens inside? Or is it also part of what happens inside? And the one that sits most uncomfortably, every person you have ever dismissed as seeing things was having a real perceptual experience generated by a real brain responding to real stimuli through mechanisms that are partly understood and partly not. The question was never whether they were seeing something. The question was always what. What if the answer is more physical, more structural, more measurable, and more ancient than either the believers or the skeptics have been willing to admit? And what if the only reason most of us have never seen it is not that it isn't there, but that we have never been still enough, long enough, to let our own brains open the gates? If that last question landed differently than you expected, if it moved this from interesting, strange belief to something that demands your serious attention, you're in the right place. This channel lives at the edge where neuroscience meets ancient wisdom, where measurable physical reality meets the full strangeness of human perception, where the comfortable categories of science and spirituality stop being adequate and the real questions begin. Every week, we go here. Hit subscribe, turn on notifications, because the next one is already waiting. You have been radiating light your entire life. Maybe it's time to start paying attention to what kind.